Thank you very much once again. We're meeting here tonight at the Thabo Mbeki Africa Day Lecture, which has become the UNISA and the Thabo Mbeki Foundation important calendar day in our year. You are all welcome. We'll be starting shortly. My name is Thogo Titiza, member of the Thabo Mbeki Foundation trustees, but also member of staff of the University of South Africa. Well, for now. So I'd like to welcome you all on behalf of the Thabo Mbeki Foundation and UNISA, and we'll be starting with our proceedings. And I'm sure our listeners at home are also here with us in spirit, as SAFM, our partner, and also Channel Africa are actually having a live show tonight for this important lecture. I think for now we now welcome our delegation. I can see they are led by one member of the trustees, Advocate Mochanku Kumbi. Welcome to Mrs. Makanya, Mrs. Mbeki, Mrs. Salim, our former Minister of Justice, Comrade Richard Mabandla, Dr. Tong, and one of our TMF associates and friend, Pel Lutuli. You're all welcome. And my young lady, Kopano, who taught me a bit about, should I say, Facebook. You're welcome. Now welcome Professor Pejnath, the delegation of the Gambia. I'm Professor Mlamu, welcome. This I'm not only doing for you, but I'm doing for our guests at home, so that they know who are some of the important dignitaries who are here. Ambassador Mpunga, who's seated here, and our partner, head of MISTRA, Joel Nechitenje. I've also seen Bishop Sioka and Mrs. Sioka. I've seen Professor Sal of the Africa Institute and the International Advisory Committee member of Timali, Professor Adebayo Lugoshi. You're all welcome. Our delegation from the Gambia, you're all welcome. Our Excellencies, former Minister, Deputy Minister, and Deputy Vice Chancellor of UJ, Ambassador. We have very important guests here from the Gambia, led by Ambassador Extraordinaire, Sidi Lete. Once again, I would like to welcome you on behalf of the Thabo Mbeki Foundation and the University of South Africa. My name is Thogo Titiza, your program director for tonight. I'd like to recognize our honored guests that are here. Justice Mwepe, Chancellor of the University of South Africa, Her Excellency Dr. Esau GSID, Vice President of Gambia, Dr. Thabo Mbeki, former President of the Republic of South Africa, and Mrs. Mbeki, His Excellency Dr. Salim Ahmed Salim, former Secretary General of the Organization of African Unity, and Mrs. Salim. Honorable Mamadou Sabali, Gambian Minister of Presidential Affairs and Secretary General. Honorable A. Yange, Gambian Minister of Foreign Affairs. Honorable Dr. Abubakar Senghor, Gambian Minister of Higher Education. Our Vice Chancellor, Professor Mandla Makanya and Mrs. Makanya. Professor Muhammadu Ka, Vice Chancellor of the University of Gambia. His Excellency Ben Mpoko, Ambassador of Democratic Republic of Congo and Dean of South African Ambassadors. Ambassador Mpungwe and all other ambassadors present here today, representatives of the South African national, provincial, and local government present, the trustees of the Thabo Mbeki Foundation, leaders of various political parties who are here, members of the UNISA executive and extended management, business community, our media fraternity, distinguished guests, members of the audience, and more particularly the students of UNISA and other universities surrounding Pretoria as well as Gauteng in general. You are all welcome. We would also want to recognize SAFM and Channel Africa, who have been our partners for some time, particularly SAFM, in ensuring that our guests at home, here in South Africa and also in the continent, can have a glimpse of what we are discussing in this important day. Africa Day Lecture has become an important calendar of the Thabo Mbeki Foundation as well as the University of South Africa. It is a day in which we celebrate Africa Day in a special way, in which we reflect on the issues that face our continent. We don't only look at what are the challenges, but also we look at what are the opportunities that lie ahead. And more importantly, this year's lecture, we have Dr. Salim Salim, who had been at the helm of the Organization of African Unity, who has part of the history of our continent, but today we are challenging him to reflect on the future. What should be the defining leadership for our continent today and the one that we hope for? I would like to welcome to the podium our Vice Chancellor and Principal, Professor Mandla Makanya, to come and welcome you.
Mrs. Togo Titiza, our program director, thank you so much for this opportunity. The Honorable Justice B.M. Ngwepe, the Chancellor of the University of South Africa, and also the Vice President of the African Court. Her Excellency Dr. Isatou Nije Saidi, Vice President of the Republic of Gambia, Dr. Thabo Mbeki, former President of the Republic of South Africa, and Mrs. Zanele Mbeki, His Excellency Dr. Salim Ahmed Salim, former Secretary General of the Organization of African Union, and Mrs. Salim, Honorable Mamadou Sabali, Gambian Minister of Presidential Affairs and Secretary General, Honorable Mamo A. Jane, Gambian Minister of Foreign Affairs, Honorable Dr. Abubakar Senghor, Gambian Minister of Higher Education, Mrs. Makanya, Professor Muhammadu Vice-Chancellor of the University of Gambia, His Excellency Mr. Bene Mboko, Ambassador of the Democratic Republic of Congo and the Dean of the South African Ambassadors, Your Excellencies, Ambassadors and High Commissioners present, representatives from the South African national, provincial and local government present, Dr. Brigalia Bam, former head of the Independent Electoral Commission, in your absence, as we are informed that you are not well this time, but also as the current founder of Women's Development Foundation, Social Development and Community Services, and all the members of the Thabo Mbeki Foundation. Leaders of the various political parties present, members of UNISA Executive and Extended Management present, Ms. Kusum Kailan, and other members of the foundation, members of the ecclesiastical community present, members of the business community present, members of the media fraternity present, distinguished members of the audience, our students, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Dumelang, Sanibonan, Huyenan, Bonsoir, Karibu. Once more, the University of South Africa and the Thabo Mbeki African Leadership Institute are reaping the benefits of our strategic decision to partner with the Thabo Mbeki Foundation in hosting the 5th Thabo Mbeki African Day Lecture. It is a great honor and privilege to extend a warm African welcome to all of you as our honored guests on the occasion of the 5th Thabo Mbeki Foundation Africa Day Lecture. I would like to note with much appreciation all the dignitaries and diplomats in our midst. The warmth I extend to you will make you forget for one moment that we are now entering the winter season in the Southern Hemisphere. A special welcome to the patron of the Thabo Mbeki African Leadership Institute, His Excellency Dr. Thabo Mbeki, who in a real sense has become part of the UNISA family. That you always make time to be with us at UNISA on occasions like this, despite your heavy international, continental, and national commitments, has a profound significance for our hearts and minds. Mindful of the fact that our keynote speaker and special guest, His Excellency Dr. Salim Ahmed Salim, is to be introduced, I extend to you, son of Africa, an African Ubuntu welcome to South Africa and UNISA. We are truly honored by the presence of a great African leader of your international stature. As I will say in Kiswahili, Karibu. In your presence, we can feel the reverberating spirit of your comrade and great African statesman, the late Mwalimu Julius Nyerere. 51 years ago, the African continent embarked on a journey of uniting the people of the continent and breaking the yoke of colonialism. 51 years later, the African continent, having achieved the historic mission of decolonization, is at a crossroads characterized by paradox. Africa faces great potential for economic prosperity, but also the serious threat of political and social instability in various parts of the continent. In other words, the 51st celebration of Africa Day for our beloved continent comes at a time of unprecedented levels of economic growth and maturing political systems, but also of ongoing challenges and threats. It is against this background that our quest for the African Renaissance and endeavors to make real the promise of claiming the 21st century as an African century has to be contextualized. The topic of today's main address, defining a leadership paradigm for a new Africa, is most appropriate, more so given that the African Union has just launched the drafting of Agenda 2063. While it is important to note and deal with the threats to Africa's development, such as terrorism, especially from groups who thrive and prey on the most vulnerable amongst us, it is even more crucial to remind the world that Africa has changed and is changing for the better. The African Governance Report 2, AGR 2, states that markers of political maturity, such as elections, have come to be accepted and respected by both opposition and incumbent political parties throughout our continent. AGR 2 explains that, quote, in the decade 1996 to 2006, 44 elections were conducted in sub-Saharan Africa. From 2005 to 2007, 26 presidential and 28 parliamentary elections were held on the continent, unquote. This year alone, we'll see about 20 elections taking place. Citizens from South Africa, Malawi, Algeria, and Tunisia, amongst others, are welcoming new democratic governments and leaders. Again, while it is important to note the positive strides made by institutions like the African Union and mechanisms like the African Peer Review Mechanism, it is also important to acknowledge that more political work needs to be done in the Great Lakes region, in the Sudan, Northern Africa, to ensure that citizens in those parts of our continent truly come to enjoy Africa's new narrative. A politically stable Africa will enable government leaders and citizens to focus their full attention on addressing problems like corruption and poor service delivery, challenges which are hampering the continent's socio-economic development trajectory. The United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, for instance, in its recent report explains that corruption is costing the continent over $148 million per annum. In addition to this, 50% of the tax revenue and 25% of continent's GDP illicitly exits the continent through corrupt practices. And more worryingly, for initiatives like intra-Africa trade and development, these corrupt practices are being perpetuated by multinational corporations. Therefore, while tremendous strides continue to be made in the arena of building peace and strengthening democratic processes and systems, it is important for African citizens, states, and the African Union to work towards ensuring that the continent uses its current economic growth windfall to foster good governance models and ensure that the economic pie is shared by all Africans. As the World Bank recently reported, the good work that has been taking place has seen the continent grow by over 5.2% in 2014, driven mainly by its natural resources, infrastructure programs, and local consumption levels. However, while this economic growth is a positive development, the warnings from leading African scholars and activists are important to ponder. A number of African scholars and activists warn that the African continent's economic growth should not be solely based on its mineral resources, and that the middle class set to propel economic growth on the continent should be problematized. Acknowledging the fact that economic growth on the continent is occurring, it is important to promote and advance plans and initiatives that will see the economic growth narrative impact as many Africans as possible. It is for this reason that all African citizens and continental institutions need to contribute towards the implementation of various Pan-African programs and initiatives. In this context, one can refer to the recently launched African Union's Agenda 2063. This program's 50-year vision for the continent is clearly inspired by the economic and regional integration initiatives found in both the Lagos Plan of Action in 1980 and the Abuja Treaty of 1991, shaped by the new Partnership for Africa's Development, NEPAD, and draws from other continent-wide initiatives such as African Development Bank's Africa 50 Infrastructure Development Fund. The political and economic strides the continent has made, as briefly enumerated above, however, need to be accompanied by a uniting vision on how best to utilize Africa's natural resources and develop its human capital for the benefit of our continent as a whole. It is for this reason that African states and citizens need to utilize the African Renaissance philosophy to ensure that important variables of development like foreign direct investment and intra-trade and development are researched continentally and used to alleviate poverty and underdevelopment, as some scholars argue. So while the United Nations World Investment Report of 2013 indicates that, quote, foreign direct investment inflows to Africa grew to $50 billion in 2012, a rise of 5% over the previous year, unquote, African governments and citizens need to interrogate whether this foreign direct investment is assisting their own individual needs in the areas of science education, agriculture, poverty eradication, and other developmental programs. The true marker of Africa's development would be how we are able to implement a socio-economic narrative that has the continent's ending the 21st century as a success story. As an African university, UNISA and the broader community of African scholars and public intellectuals must define the role that we must play in advancing the African agenda of peace and prosperity, of innovation and the restoration of African dignity. Forums like this one should challenge scholars and knowledge workers of all kinds to critically reflect on issues raised and seek ways of advancing the African agenda as Africa's destiny beckons us. We must always be reminded that a meaningful dialogue between ideas and reality, between theory and practice, is at the core of human progress in any society. I would like to conclude my remarks by expressing our deep appreciation for this event, which puts our university on the world map. Jean Martial's famous proverb captures the essence of my gratitude as he says, quote, gratitude is the memory of the heart, unquote. With these few words, allow me to introduce His Excellency Dr. Thabo Mbeki, who will in turn introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Salim Ahmed Salim. Dr. Thabo Mbeki does not like lengthy introductions, as you all know. Dr. Mbeki says that long introductions often sound like an obituary. We also know that he often questions the notion of, quote, keynote speaker, unquote. So without delay, and given what I've just highlighted, let me welcome our former President of the Republic of South Africa, the relentless champion of the African Renaissance and the faith.
Thank you very much, Professor Makanya. Let me start by joining Professor Makanya in welcoming Her Excellency, the Vice President of the Republic of Gambia. Thank you very much indeed for blessing our lecture by coming here. But of course, I must also say thank you very much to our lecturer today. When we approached him to request him to speak, to deliver this year's Africa Day lecture, he didn't hesitate, he didn't he didn't hesitate to say, I'm ready to come. And I wasn't surprised about that because I've had the fortune of knowing Dr. Salim Ahmed Salim for some years, watched him, followed him, criticized him. You'd remember that some time ago I was president of South Africa. Now, one of the things that the president does is to receive ambassadors. Now, for an ambassador to be accredited to a country, they've got something called an agrément. It's an agreement in French. So you don't just arrive in a country and say, I've come to represent Tanzania. You have to say to the host country, we want to send so-and-so as our ambassador. And then the country agrees, and then you come. Now, while I was president, if ever anybody came, foreign minister comes to, if ever she came and said, there's an ambassador, then I request to deploy an ambassador who is 22 years old, I would say no. I mean, how can you deploy a baby as an ambassador? But I would have been wrong in the case of Dr. Salim because when he took his first ambassadorial post, he was 22 years old. I think that tells you what kind of person we have tonight as our distinguished lecturer. We are talking here about defining this leadership paradigm. My sense is that Dr. Salim is in fact exactly the kind of leader that we need. I don't know if he is himself the paradigm. In 1989, the leadership of the ANC decided that it was clear that the country was drifting towards negotiations. And therefore that we needed to prepare for that. So we sat in Lusaka and drafted a document dealing with this challenge of negotiations and decided that we would then consult the frontline states about this document before taking it to the OAU. So we drafted it. And the first country we visited to consult on the document was Tanzania. And so we got to Dar es Salaam, an appointment arranged with the government. Dr. Salim at the time was Deputy Prime Minister of Tanzania. So we met a delegation which he led. And didn't he attack us? He says, but you come here, you're talking about negotiating with the Boers. You should be fighting the Boers, you must remove them, overthrow them. What is this negotiation? Big trouble. Plenty trouble. So, you know, when we finished that meeting and went to our hotel, we were very depressed. Our delegation was led by the late O.R. Tambo. He was the only one who was not depressed. The rest of us were saying, no, this is a very bad start. Because Salim gave us a lot of trouble. And then he said to us, of course, never mind what we are saying. Tomorrow you are going to meet with Mwalimu, which we did. But what he did, which we didn't understand, was to prepare us for the meeting with Mwalimu. to make sure that we prepare our arguments correctly so that by the time we get to Mwalimu, we are able to convince him. And indeed, by the time we met Mwalimu, we were well armed. Because when he came at us with his arguments, we knew how to respond. Because overnight we had prepared, thanks to what Dr. Salim Ahmed Salim did to prepare us. But here you have, when we say we're proudly African, I think we're proudly African because of people like him. If you look at all of the things he has done and continues to do today, and I'm sure many of us, and I'm sure Julius here, Julius Malema here, also thinks the same. I'm saying that all of us would always say, we also want to be like Salim Ahmed Salim. To set an example as Ambassador of Tanzania, as Prime Minister of Tanzania, Deputy Prime Minister, various ministerial jobs, as everybody has said, served at the OAU for 12 years as Secretary General, critical role at a critical time, was ambassador at the UN, did a lot of work at the United Nations, non-aligned movement and so on. This is a person, this is an African who's outstanding in terms of the national duties he carried out in Tanzania, in terms of the duties he carried out on our continent, and the duties he carried out globally. Always and always determined to ensure that he represents us, the Africans, properly. So that there could not be anybody anywhere in the world who would say anything negative about Africans, so long as that Africanness was defined by what Salim Ahmed Salim did. Thank you very much for coming, and we look forward to listening to you. Thanks a lot.
Well, it's extremely difficult to say anything after what President Thabo Mbeki has said. Thank you very much, sir. You exaggerated a bit, but that's a prerogative of former president. Your Excellency, former President of South Africa, Dr. Thabo Mbeki, the Honorable Vice President of the Gambia, Honorable Ministers, Honorable Leaders of UNISA, members of the Board of Trustees of the Thabo Mbeki Foundation, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, and I'll emulate the famous expression of my Nigerian brothers and sisters, all protocols observed. As we are all very much aware that on Africa Day, we formally commemorate the creation of the Organization of African Unity in 1963, that is 51 years from this Sunday, as well as the inception of its successor, the African Union, just 12 years ago. Obviously, these landmark occasions signify the achievements of our liberated continent, the collective assertion of freedom, equality, and distinctly Pan-African identity, as well as reflect on our colonial past and as we define the future direction for our individual countries and our continent as a whole. We also take this day to honor the countless lives that were dedicated to our struggle, those whose contributions shall forever continue to inspire us and remain indispensable in our collective efforts to realize a peaceful, stable, prosperous, and united Africa much sooner than later. Let me therefore hasten to pay my special tribute to you, President Mbeki, for your own personal contribution in that regard. Your tireless efforts in bringing peace and developing new thought leadership on an accelerated socio-economic development on the continent is well appreciated and greatly valued. I therefore take this opportunity to say to you, thank you very much, sir, and it's not a question of reciprocity. Thank you very much for dedicating your entire life to the liberation and meaningful socio-economic transformation of our people in our continent. The African continent left behind by the likes of Kwame Nkrumah, Gamal Abdel Nasser, Mwalimu Julius Nyerere, Ahmed Ben Bella, Modibo Keita, Abubakar Tafawa Balewa, Emperor Haile Selassie, Kenneth Kaunda, Jomo Kenyatta, Patrice Lumumba, Amilcar Cabral, Eduardo Mondlane, Agostinho Neto, Silvanus Olympio, Milton Magai, Felix Houphouët-Boigny, Leopold Sédar Senghor, and your very own Oliver Tambo, and our recently departed leader and hero, Tata Nelson Mandela, just to mention a few, who constituted the freedom generation of African leadership. Finds you, President Mbeki, a committed foot soldier as the continent seeks to confidently march into the future and make the 21st century a rightfully its own. As I was preparing for this lecture, I was debating whether I should say something simply as personal reflection. After a lot of thinking, I said, yes, I'll do that. So I want to say a few things, and especially in relation to the struggle for freedom and human dignity in our continent. I spent a greater part of my youth and considerable part of my adult life dealing with the issues of freedom, human dignity, and liberation. I did so at home in Tanzania, where I took active part in students and youth organizations in Zanzibar from the age of 17. In New York, where I served as envoy of my country to the United Nations and also as chairman of the United Nations Committee on Decolonization, which was called the Committee 24 then, for 8 years. And in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, where I served as Secretary General of the Organization of African Unity for 3 terms lasting 12 years. I especially reflected on the situation of South Africa and what the people of this country were going through, and the concrete support given by Africa in particular, and the international community in general, in the course of this reflection, 4 events which I was directly associated in one or the other come to my mind. First, the historic decision of the United Nations to expel the delegation of the apartheid regime from participating in the United Nations General Assembly. This happened in 1974, in a month which I happened to have been the chairman of the African group, and together with my African colleagues, we spearheaded the call for the rejection of the credentials of the regime of South Africa. But we went more than that. In previous years, every year, the credentials of South Africa were challenged, and the President of the General Assembly will give a ruling. There was a famous ruling by the then President of the General Assembly from Norway, Mr. Hambro, who said, this rejection of the credentials represents a warning, a solemn warning, as solemn as it can be against the apartheid regime, and stopped there. So this time around we said no. This time around, frankly, the rejection of the credentials should mean that the South African delegation has to get out of here. Unfortunately, the President of the General Assembly at that time was no less a person than Abdulaziz Bouteflika, then Foreign Minister of Algeria, now the President of Algeria. We went to see the President, myself and a few other African colleagues, to say, look, we don't want to put you in an embarrassing situation. So we don't want you to give a ruling. All we do, we'll come with a suggestion for the expulsion of the South African delegation, and then, of course, the Assembly will decide. He said, no, I have my own moral responsibility and political responsibility, so I shall take the decision. And so he gave a ruling which simply stipulated that the South African delegation could not be in that hall, and it had to go out. This decision, by the way, was challenged by some of our friends in the West. It was, however, sustained because we had the required majority to sustain the decision. This was a major blow against the apartheid regime and a significant support to the South African struggle, and especially its liberation movement and other democratic forces led by the African National Congress, whose representatives worked very closely with us in that enterprise. The second event was the consideration by the United Nations Security Council of the Soweto Uprising in June 1976. I was then the permanent representative of Tanzania to the Security Council, and there was quite a bitter and acrimonious debate when the representative of the regime tried to justify the wanton killings of unarmed young boys and girls by the security forces. It was emotionally charged atmosphere, given the careless disregard for human beings demonstrated. And quite frankly, I must confess, I lost my temper, and I was being very undiplomatic. But I had to say what had to be said. The third event was both interesting and fascinating, but less dramatic. In January 1976, I was the president of the Security Council as the council was discussing the legal occupation of Namibia by South Africa. I was then privately informed by a distinguished ambassador from one of the Western countries, who for obvious reasons will remain anonymous. He said the ambassador of South Africa wanted to see me. And I said, fine. If he wants to see me as the president of Tanzania, that is out of the question. But if he wants to see me as president of the United Nations Security Council, of course I was obliged to see him, especially because his regime is illegally occupying Namibia. The ambassador in question seemed surprised, because you have to remember at that time, African representatives, by and large, had nothing to do with the representative of South Africa at the UN. He was surprised, and his surprise surprised me. Because he went to suggest that such a meeting could take place outside the UN, privately, quietly. In fact, I should mention also that the ambassador in question of South Africa at that time also told me, you can come and visit Namibia, privately, quietly, nobody would know. I said to the ambassador of South Africa at that time, I said, look, my friend, if I come to Namibia, I will come publicly with all the paraphernalia of publicity. So, well, the last impression, the last recollection is that when I came to South Africa for the first time in my life, this is a history. most, if not all, African countries made it very clear that the officials would not come to South Africa. In fact, in my passport, it says, visit all foreign countries with the exception of South Africa. And that was the case. That was the case of many African countries. So the first time I came to South Africa is in 1993, when I led, and this was the time when the country was preparing for democratic elections. I led an OU delegation, and that was the first time the OU visited South Africa, by the way, comprising of different senior officials of various nationalities. And we, both for me and all my African colleagues, the visit was extremely emotional when we landed in Johannesburg. Because quite frankly, even though we were all confident that one time South Africa will be free, will be liberated, none of us had that high expectation that the freedom would come at the time it came. So it was really an overwhelming emotion for all of us. During that occasion, I was privileged to meet with the leadership of South Africa at that time. I met with Madiba at Umtata, met with President de Klerk in Cape Town, Prince Buthelezi in Urundi, KwaZulu-Natal, the President of the Pan-Africanist Congress, Mr. Makwetu, in Johannesburg, and leaders of the Freedom Front, including General Viljoen, then former Chief of the Armed Forces. And going to meet the Freedom Front, many people were saying, why are you going to meet the Freedom Front? I said, it's important to meet them. And I said to General Viljoen, I remember, I said, General, we haven't met physically, but we have met in Angola. I think he knew what I meant, so there was no discussion. So those are thinking that the reflections I had, and I thought, well, I must share them with you, because they are very personal, nothing official. It's simply how I felt during that period. Now, if I've decided to recite these experiences, it's only to tell you that I, like many other African colleagues, felt very close to the struggle against apartheid and considered it as our own struggle. It was an African struggle. And it doesn't matter, the contribution of Africans may have varied from one country to another, but I can tell you, one of the things which is extremely important, every single African identified himself or herself with the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. I should have come with a laptop, maybe. Well, it is therefore important that I make an early conclusion in my submission that as we focus on our continent's future in a manner that effectively meets the massive challenges and exploit the vast opportunity that exists in Africa's development and prosperous future, at the very least, these leadership attributes need to be internalized and creatively applied in shaping Africa's current future cadre of leadership. I refer here to the attributes which are shown by the founding fathers and also by people like Thabo Mbeki. It is tragic that precisely because of its profound commitment to the continent's meaningful emancipation, the freedom generation of African leadership was effectively undermined during the first decade of Africa's independence. This was the height of the Cold War tensions as competing powers sought to extend their respective sphere of influence on the continent. Africa's promise and hope for a meaningful Uhuru disappeared fast, and post-independence Africa became characterized by wars, instabilities, and undemocratic regimes, thereby losing that transformative and developmental vision that has characterized and energized nationalist and Pan-African struggles of our forebears. Yet all was not lost, particularly in the Southern African region, where the strong leadership of the frontline states and the liberation movements sustained the vanguard of the African revolution within the region and within the continent, as well as through the non-alignment movement and the international community at large. In this context, it is in this context one of the early Pan-Africanist acts by President Mandela's administration, after coming to power in 1994, was to resuscitate the cause for Africa's rebirth or renaissance, in which you, Mr. President Mbeki, have been and continue to be actively involved. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, to chart the path forward, we must be frank in our assessments of Africa's since the era of collective independence. Now we are free. It's indeed pertinent to ask ourselves whether the aims and objectives articulated by the pioneers of our independence movement have been achieved, or for that matter, anywhere near fulfillment. I'm afraid at a certain juncture of the past few decades, we seem to have lost the compass with all its attendant implications. It is indeed a fact that though our countries are free, the aims and objectives of the freedom struggle has yet to be attained in many of our countries. When we fought for freedom, we did not just fight for the purpose of replacing the white colonialism. The objective was to improve the lot of our people. It was intended to ensure larger freedoms, including the right to decide on how we are governed, by whom, and for what period. It was to remove injustice and ensure that the country's resources are utilized for the betterment of our people. It was to fight disease, ignorance, and abject poverty, to change the lives of our people and to transform the continent from what it used to be called the Dark Continent to the continent which is living up to its responsibilities. As we therefore mark the 51 years since the laying the foundation of African unity and reflect and plan for the future, there are some soul-searching questions which we as Africans need to ask ourselves. Why is it a continent which is one of the richest, if not the richest, in terms of resources, both human and material, continues to have the poorest people? How can we rationally explain the continued and in some cases escalating internal conflicts in some parts of our continent with attendant losses of millions of lives, human misery and destruction, as well as forcing millions of our people to vote with their feet? How do we erase the image of a continent where corruption is considered endemic? How do we sustain and better utilize the current decade-old achievements of economic growth into a shared prosperity for all? Indeed, some of our leaders in Africa, including you, President Mbeki, have characterized the 21st century as Africa's century. I believe that this is possible, desirable, achievable, and most of all, necessary. This should be the clarion of the new generation of young people who, unlike in our times, has more privileges of global interconnectivity, including advanced communication technology, to use for fulfilling its generational mission. But we must move with seriousness and deliberate speed in addressing all those problems which are within our means to resolve. These include to improve governance. Indeed, this is the #1 issue. All those who lead at whatever level, but especially at national leaders, must be held accountable and act in a manner which makes them truly servants of the people who have elected them to power. It is significant to observe that in this context, that practical experience has already demonstrated that where there is a responsible, accountable, and incorruptible leadership abiding by the principles of good governance, their countries have made enormous progress in socio-economic development. Good governance, democracy, accountability, and transparency should be nurtured and sustained, and above all, be made an essential component of our societies. Africa, which has suffered a lot of indignities and inhumanity due to massive violations of our people's rights, should be in the forefront for the protection and respect of human rights. To achieve this, it is imperative to build democratic institutions, improve our educational system, and strengthen our civil societies. It is also in this context that one has to take note of the declaration issued by the OAU heads of states and government in February 1990, following the end of the Cold War, on the political and socio-economic situation in Africa and the fundamental changes taking place in the world. In essence, the declaration underscored Africa's commitment to democracy, human rights, rule of law, good governance as fundamental prerequisites for sustainable socio-economic development on the continent. The establishment of the new Partnership for Africa's Development, NEPAD, by the OAU heads of states and government in July 2001 in Lusaka, Zambia, was meant to provide an overarching vision and policy framework for accelerating economic cooperation and integration among African countries. This measure was to be further strengthened by the establishment of the African Peer Review Mechanism in 2003 by the African Union, which focuses on the importance of good governance in pursuing the new African dream for its alliances. We must strive to uplift the lot of our people. Economic and social transformation is a prerequisite condition. In this context, a number of factors need to be taken into account. In recent years, Africa has had strong economic growth records, largely attributed to the comparative advantage that we have on natural resources and the demands fueled by the strong growth in the largest emerging economies in Latin America and Asia. However, this growth has not translated into further reduction of poverty, nor income and wealth inequality as we expected. We must guard against the growing inequities in our societies, which cause resentment and despair among our people, and especially the millions of unemployed young people. If we fail to redress this imbalance, we run the risk of implosion and conflict. We must gradually but firmly eliminate the contradiction of a very rich continent inhabited by the poorest people. Africa has a strong comparative advantage in natural resources that for many years has turned out to be more of a curse than a blessing. With major discovery of oil and gas reserves in several African countries joining the traditional oil-producing countries, Africa should heed the lessons of the last oil boom that saw being squandered by both local and multinational greed. We cannot afford to repeat the mistakes of yesterday. Africa's immense natural resources must be mobilized properly used for its development. After years of structural economic transformation that focus on economic growth, it is crucial to note the necessity of adopting inclusive socio-economic development for our continent to survive the challenges and development and ensure the opportunities of sustainable development. The necessity of ensuring that wealth and resources of Africa are used to benefit all people and not just channeled towards the gains of a few cannot be overstated. Inclusive socio-economic development, ensuring that all individuals can meet the basic needs of their families, that all of the continent's diverse social, political, and economic groups feel equally part of their societies, and that all individuals who strive for a better tomorrow can be given equitable opportunities to improve their livelihood, constituted the vision of our founding fathers, and must constitute the guiding light of our current and future generations of leaders. Without such inclusive development, our societies will remain plagued by political marginalization and socioeconomic inequalities, and it is these conditions that inflame violence and ultimately threaten our collective peace, security, and development. This move towards inclusive economy must go hand in hand with the efforts of uplifting the status and appreciate the role of our women in economic and political leadership. The women of Africa. The women of Africa have been the most resilient and dynamic force. They constitute more than 50% of the entire population. They have played a crucial role in the struggle for independence and liberation wars. In conflict situations, they bear a disproportionate burden of suffering. They have played and continue to play a pivotal role in all facets of economic and social development. But in most of our countries, I repeat, in most of our countries, their full potential has yet to be utilized. And their role in decision-making continues to be, by and large, sadly marginal. Currently, African countries are taking significant steps aimed at empowering women, and this is a step which must be encouraged. This vital process needs to be encouraged and intensified. This powerful force, when properly empowered and allowed to make full use of their potential, will unleash an irreversible movement toward the political, social, and economic emancipation of our continent. Of equal importance is the need to recognize the current demographic trend of the continent, where 60% of Africans are below the age of 40. With almost 200 million people aged between 15 and 24, Africa has the youngest population in the world. Between 2000 and 2008, Africa's working age population grew from 443 million to 550 million, an increase of 25%. In annual terms, this is the growth of 13 million or 2.7% per year. If this trend continues, the continent's labor force will be 1 billion strong by the year 2040, making it the largest in the world, surpassing both China and India. In this context, it is imperative to ensure that policies and actions which constitute the agenda of the future make effective use of this dynamic. Quite often, this is considered as a time bomb, but it is a time bomb if only we do not make use of it positively. Hence, we must invest in whatever way necessary to ensure we effectively nurture and utilize this comparative advantage we hold, not only to our greater success in the struggle for equitable prosperity, but also for our survival from potential conflicts. Similarly, fundamental advances in technology are radically changing how we organize our societies and engage one another. Advances in medical, industrial, and digital technologies are constantly pushing the boundaries on how we imagine the future. The achievements made in 3D printing and nanotechnology over the past 3 years has alone confidently assured me that our world will be radically different in 20 years or more. The internet and mobile phone have become great equalizers, creating an open space through which instantaneous communication and knowledge sharing can occur across massive territorial, social, and cultural divides. It is now an established fact that social media is crucially transforming how each individual perceives and engages what's around them. Nigerian-American author Teju Cole recently described the crux of the social media phenomenon in a lecture at Duke University's Kennan Institute of Ethics as follows. Each person is the command center of a new way of thinking about the world. We must collectively contend with the new and more diverse declarations of human equality and visibility. This then brings me to the imperative necessity of regional integration, an objective which has clearly been adumbrated by the then Organization of African Unity and now the African Union. But the pace of integration continues to be agonizingly slow, even though there are important efforts and achievements of the various sub-regional organizations. No single African country, however important or well-endowed, can have any serious impact on a world scale. The African collective cannot be ignored. In this context, We should learn from experiences of our European friends and partners. Many of these countries in Europe are strong politically, economically, scientifically, and militarily. They bear no comparison to individual African countries. Yet they have recognized their individual disadvantages and the merits of cooperation and integration in order inter alia to cope with the present and future challenges and opportunities facing them. In my view, for Africa, regional cooperation and integration is not a matter of choice, but survival. African leaders have taken a number of key decisions toward the realization of regional integration. Regrettably, however, there's a great hiatus between those decisions and actual implementation. One of the main challenges to this is how we take seriously the question of national and region-wide infrastructural development and maintenance. There's an urgent need to improve infrastructure and, among other things, gave practical meaning to the commitment to facilitate the free movement of goods and people. Apart from intra-regional infrastructural development and strengthening our regional economic schemes, we have a duty to bring the issues of United Africa to the people. While I'm optimistic that the United Africa dream will be realized in the coming years, it is discouraging to see how ineffectively we have performed in strengthening the Pan-African identity among our people and across borders. We are still lingering in an era of prejudices and stereotypes among us, keeping our peoples farther apart instead of moving us closer as people with shared history, challenges, opportunities, strength, identity, and destiny. We need to use both continental and intergovernmental and non-governmental institutions to project, promote, and nurture the vision of a united Africa for a new generation to effect within the coming years. In the coming years, Africa must continue efforts in dealing with the scourge of conflict, which has done so much damage to our people and societies. As a follow-up to the declaration issued by the OAU heads of states and government in February 1990, following the end of the Cold War, on the political and socio-economic situation in Africa and the fundamental changes taking place in the world, it was felt that the existence of peace and stability on the continent was critical in pursuing the goals and objectives that Africa had set itself in 1990. The OAU mechanism for conflict prevention, management, and resolution was therefore adopted in the Cairo OAU summit in July 1993. It was strongly felt that with the Cold War out of the way, Africa was indeed capable of resolving its own conflicts if it was freed from any external interferences. The African Union, through its Peace and Security Council, is making an important contribution. Its efforts need to be strengthened and augmented by inter alia through the provision of resources. This is one area where the goodwill of the international community in support of Africa's efforts has been clearly demonstrated. But Africa needs to do more, much more itself. Those African countries which are better endowed should really seriously assist in providing significant financial support. In my opinion, it is unacceptable to rely mainly on external assistance in carrying out the various peace support operations. Furthermore, such excessive external dependence can be quite costly. I know this from personal experience when I served as Secretary General of the OAU, and also when I was the African Union Special Envoy and Chief Mediator in the Abuja Inter-Sudanese Peace Talks in Darfur. Thus, ultimately, it's up to our leaders, present and future, who can and should prevent conflicts through entrenching and practicing democratic governance, fair distribution of resources, and proper and just treatment to all citizens, but also equipping our continental organization with the means to perform its responsibilities. In view of the ongoing transformative shifts, we must acknowledge that the inherent social contract with our own society, the relationship between the people, governments, and business as it exists today, is out of sync with the directions in which our societies are headed. The concentration of wealth and power in the hands of small elite is no longer sustainable. As we witness developments occurring both within and beyond the continent, I see a new future where the individual is more empowered than ever before to shape his or her own destiny. This will be more so as the spread of genuine democracy on the continent works to push forward the frontiers of, to push back the frontiers of democracy and significantly unleash the creative potential of our people. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, when I reflect on the new paradigm of leadership, I'm especially cognizant of the words of the late Pan-Africanist and a very good friend of mine, Dr. Tajuddin Abdurrahim, who in 2005 wrote as follows: instead of constantly enumerating what this leader or that leader is doing, why don't you ask yourself what, no matter how small, you are doing as an individual, a member of an organization, part of a community, your profession, and whatever station you are, to advance the cause of Africa and the dignity of the African. We can all do something or do nothing. It is here where vast opportunities present themselves before the next generations of Africans. Our generation was responsible for ushering in our continent from the era of colonialism, racial discrimination, apartheid, to an era of independence. It will be your generation's responsibility for ushering us a brand new world, a world where the new African rising phenomena is truly achieved and secured. It is in this light that I would like to enumerate 3 principles for a new paradigm of leadership in a transforming Africa. Principle number 1, just like our founding fathers and the generations of leaders that preceded them, I implore our future generations of leaders to hold fast to a new vision of Africa, one in which our continent is united, prosperous, and at peace both with itself and the rest of the world. These new leaders must remain steadfast to their convictions, underpinned by beacons of morality and humanity, and constantly strive to achieve their visions in the face of all obstacles and anyone who would rebuke such aspiration. Our new leaders must remain cognizant that realizing these visions may appear daunting, and I can certainly acknowledge that these journeys will not be easy. However, these are journeys in life that are most worthy ones to embark on. Principle number 2. In order to understand where Africa is headed, I urge our current and future leaders to forge a deep appreciation of where our journeys have taken us so far and how we have gotten where we are today. Africa today stands proudly upon the legacies of millions of individuals who contributed their entire lives to ensuring the future generation would have great opportunities. Each of our countries has a unique history forged from the era of colonialism through to today. Africa has leaders who are not only those who sat atop governments, but the thousands upon thousands more who started conversations in the town halls, in the communal homesteads, in universities, university lecture rooms, in markets, in neighborhood barazas, and in taverns. Leaderships know no singular shape or size or color or creed. I hope our next generation of leaders can skillfully build on our past to continue forging our new future. Principle number 3, globalize, localize, and connect. In this increasingly interconnected world, I urge our next generation of leaders to view themselves both from the perspective of the global as well as the local. Uniquely empowered through changes in technology and the requisite social constructs, these new generations now have the power not only to gather unprecedented amounts of information, but also to connect and mobilize thousands upon thousands like-minded individuals spanning the globe. However, serving as a leader not only means bringing your visions into the global arena, but more importantly, by also affecting positive changes and inspiring others back within one's community. Transformation starts here and is from the nurturing bed of one's community from which true ideas can germinate and flourish. We can all do something no matter where we are. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is these brief thoughts that I would like to leave them with you today on how I see the evolution of our leadership on the continent, I'm truly optimistic about our shared futures and the direction in which our beloved Africa is headed. I'm optimistic because we've gone through lots of difficulties. You know, there was a time when people used to write theses in the United States on the invincibility of the white redoubt. Big people, very influential people, top people, but saying really that forget it. The situation in Rhodesia will remain Rhodesia. The situation in Southwest Africa will remain that way. The situation in Mozambique will remain that way. The situation in Namibia or Southwest Africa will remain that way, to say nothing of the situation in South Africa. They did not contemplate at all that there will be dramatic changes. And look where we are now. We're celebrating the 51. We are celebrating the 51st anniversary of the OEU in an independent, democratic, non-racial, non-sexist South Africa. I therefore urge the generation of leaders, of our future leaders, many of whom may be sitting in this very room today. I urge you to build on the legacies of all those who came before you, to forge a path for those after you, to continue towards realizing a peaceful, prosperous, and united Africa. Nkosi sikelele Afrika, Mungu ibariki Afrika, asanteni sana.
Thank you very much, Dr. Salim, Ahmed Salim. Indeed, this was the history which we could not have got from any classroom. You've reminded us of the journey we have traversed as a continent, as different countries, but also you have charged us to reflect on our present and also think about our future. Most importantly, you left us with valuable lessons, one of which is that each one of us can make a difference. The University of South Africa, together with the Thabo Mbeki Foundation, in their small way, are trying to make a difference in building a cohort of thought leaders for our continent. We appreciate that some leaders can be born, but not many can be born. A lot of us will need to be shaped. And through the Thabo Mbeki Africa Leadership Institute, this is our small contribution in which we think we can make a difference in our continent. I would ask that our communications people just give us a little bit of a clip about Timali, so that some of you who are aspirant thought leaders sitting in this room, you can have a glimpse of just what we do, so that next semester, some of you can be our students.
Timali is an institute of the University of South Africa in partnership with the Thabo Mbeki Foundation. Timali is a program for the training of Africans for the political, economic, social, and cultural renewal of the African continent and its people. Our vision is towards a center of excellence for African thought leadership for Africa's renewal. A strong sense of African identity, empowered to act and empowered to become an authentic African leader in the service of humanity. to invest in and liberate new thought leaders for Africa's rejuvenation in the 21st century and beyond, in order to contribute to the ongoing process of the development of leadership on the continent, and also contribute to the resolution of the persistent problem of African underdevelopment.
Okay, my name is Lebhan Chaka. I have found the Tamale course very, very insightful.
My name is Kolisab Nisi, and I'm doing my first semester with Tamale, and it's been such an enriching experience, just learning about different leadership styles, African leadership styles.
My name is Sizwe Mbopa. I think my mind has been opened many times over so far in terms of thinking Africa first than thinking business first.
Your Excellencies, our leaders, retired, current, and aspirant, it's my very great pleasure to stand here on behalf of Dr. Bam to say a few words in acknowledging those who made it possible for us to gather as a fraternity tonight, and to reflect upon the leadership vision of our continent. Let me begin with our distinguished guest speaker, Dr. Salim Ahmed Salim, who I believe profoundly inspired us tonight with his message. And I'm sure that for all of us, young and old, we go away with a lot to think about, a lot to reflect upon, for his message has resonated with our sense of history, with our hopes and dreams and aspirations for the continent of Africa. So I'm sure you'll join me in thanking him again with a warm round of applause. We gather like this annually because of our patron, former President Thabo Mbeki, and of course Mrs. Mbeki as well. So I first invite you to thank our hosts, Dr. Mbeki and Mrs. Mbeki, for bringing us together annually in this way to confer. And former President Mbeki, for his vision and his inspiration to legions of youth and legions of current leaders. You remain a guiding light to us, and we thank you for that. And for your continued inspiration to the young leaders. In fact, they are leaders being born tonight who will benefit from what has happened here today. And what will happen in the future, we anticipate for decades to come. Professor Majda Makanya, thank you for your warm welcome to all of us, and also for your sponsorship as the leader of the institution of this particular event on an annual basis. And I think we must also applaud your affirming message, as well as the call to arms to all of us to rise to the development challenges of our continent. So thank you very much again, and also for opening the doors of the university to make it a cultural and intellectual space where people from all walks of life with all political and ideological persuasions can come together and reflect together on the major challenges which confront us. Professor Makanya. The Thabo Mbeki Foundation and the executive management of UNISA jointly host this lecture, so we'd like to thank them for the work that they've put into this and the vision which inspires it. Let us give them a round of applause. And our program director tonight, Mrs. Toko Didiza, who has run the proceedings with her usual elegance and charm and presence, We thank her as well. A whole host of staff work behind the scenes, staff from the from Tamale itself, who've worked tirelessly, unswayed by obstacles and by the stresses of organizing such a gigantic event. There are students of Tamale who are involved in the facilitation and registration process. Our UNISA corporate communication and marketing colleagues for the marketing, branding, and logistical support to the lecture. Even our security staff who ensure that everyone arrives and leaves safely. Thank you all, colleagues. Let's give them all a round of applause. A special word of thanks to SAFM, who is our broadcast partner. Thank you for the live broadcast of this lecture tonight. Let's give them a round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. And while we acknowledge them, let's also acknowledge the UNISA Radio for the live streaming of this lecture over the internet so it can be watched all over the world. Had there been a fire, we would have been safe. And that's because the Shwane Fire and Emergency Services have also been here, prepared for any eventuality. So thank you. And I mentioned that while we were sitting here, there probably are children who are born who might become the political scientists and leaders of next year and for decades to come. We've made sure that the giants who walk today and those who've walked in the past and their messages and the power of their messages will not be lost. They will be heard and they will be seen through the videographers who are here, who are recording the proceedings for posterity. Let's give them a round of applause as well. And Mrs. Campion, who's taking pictures of the events, also recording proceedings for posterity. Let's give her a round of applause as well. And our caterers, I think you can thank them in advance because you will really enjoy what they have prepared for us. Royal Mnandi, with the emphasis being on Mnandi. Caterers. Jessica and band for entertaining us with beautiful music, with more to come. Kone Jacobs and the conference cleaning and other staff at UNISA, thank you for making sure that the venue is ready for the lecture, that it does UNISA proud. Let's give them a round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. And the media here in attendance, thank you for your continued coverage of this lecture. We count on that in ensuring that the public understanding and participation in these endeavors is enlarged through your support of this lecture. And then finally, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, this event would not be possible without your gracing this event with your presence. So we thank you and wish you bon voyage. Thank you very much.